Welcome back to Photography for People Who Are Not Photographers. The big idea of the proposed step, the lesson you just completed, was how we make the decision that identifies the subject of the photo. The subject may be something dictated, like little Maria in her new dress, or it is a single object or a scene that captures our attention, such as a sunset. Once we've identified the subject, we move to the next step in the process, compose, which is the subject of this lesson. The big idea of the compose step is to use viewpoint, the position of the camera relative to the subject, to arrange the visual elements in the viewfinder, to create an image that accentuates the subject and de-emphasizes or eliminates those visual elements that detract from the subject. How do we accomplish this? We compose the photo. In this lesson, we'll focus on 5 topics: using the rule of thirds, how to adjust background, which is what surrounds the subject, how to give depth to our photos, how to frame the subject using available visual elements, and lastly, how orientation of the camera affects the photo. Let's get started by discussing one of the most widely used composition techniques, the rule of thirds. First, the rule of thirds is not a rule. It's a technique that we may use. What is it? If we divide the viewfinder into thirds, vertically and horizontally, these lines and the resulting 4 intersections are effective positions to place the subject and/or any major visual element, such as the horizon. Here's another example. When using the rule of thirds in photos of people, typically we compose the image in the viewfinder so that the person is facing the open end of the photo. For comparison purposes, here's the same photo, but cropped to center the subject. The open space on the right says there is something going on to the person's left front, but behind the camera, which makes the photo more intriguing, more engaging. When taking close-up photos of people, such as this, typically place the person's eyes, the most important part of the face, at a thirds intersection. As with the case of all rules of composition, this photo violates the one stating that the subject should be looking to the open end of the image. I took it this way because I wanted to include the beautiful curve of the New Year's Eve hat to frame his face. That's the rule of thirds. Let's focus on another topic in the compose step, the background. What is background? It is what surrounds the subject in the image. The background can be neutral, as in these studio portrait photos. A studio setting enables us to use a neutral background to emphasize the subject, which is one of our goals in the compose step of taking a photo. Most of the time, however, we do not have the freedom that a studio gives us to provide a neutral background. As a result, the background, either the whole background or one or more visual elements in the background, can be a distraction, taking attention away from the subject. Here's an example that we saw earlier, in which the red shopping bag in the background takes away from the subject of the 2 women. What if there is no studio, which allows us to control the background? We have 3 options, and typically we use a combination of these 3. Change the focus and/or change the exposure. Focus and exposure are both controlled in the camera when we are about to take the photo. We'll discuss these in the Expose module. The third way to manage the background of a photo is to change the viewpoint so the distracting visual elements are eliminated or minimized. In this photo, I elevated the camera, changed the viewpoint to be above the subject so that the rice field was the only background, eliminating a set of farm buildings that were behind the subject. And in this photo, I lowered the camera so that the distracting background of the city was eliminated, leaving only a neutral gray sky. As you compose the photos for your project, try to eliminate as much distracting background as you can by changing the viewpoint. Can we create depth in our photos? Photographs are a two-dimensional medium. Let me show you. Right now, close one eye and look around you. What you are seeing is two-dimensional, just like a photograph. Now open both eyes. What you now see is three-dimensional. You see depth in the scene. So how do we create depth in our photos? A two-dimensional medium. Three ways we can do it. The most common way is to use perspective. Here are two examples. A second way to create depth is to use decreasing contrast to show depth, as in these two photos. In landscape photos, visual elements that are further away have less contrast. The gradual reduction in contrast generates depth in a photo. In the second photo, the reduction in contrast was not caused so much by distance as by the ground fog, but it had the same effect of creating depth. Shadows can also create depth, as in this photo. Without the shadows, for example on a cloudy, gray day, the photo would look flat. This photo also shows why early morning or late afternoon are good times for taking photos, because the shadows are more pronounced and the colors are warmer, less harsh. Finally, here is an example which uses perspective, contrast, and shadows to create depth. Another technique in composing a photo is to use a visual element to frame the subject. There are two uses of the word frame in photography. The first use refers to the edge of the photo. The edges of the viewfinder define the vertical and horizontal limits of the photo. Photographers refer to visual elements as being in frame or out of frame. When we compose the photo, we attempt to get distracting visual elements out of frame by changing the viewpoint. The second use of frame refers to using visual elements within the image to frame the subject. In this photo of a sunset, the subject, the tree line at the bottom and the leaves and limbs provide a visual frame. Another example, and one final example, in which the shadows in the lower left also act as a visual frame. There is one other aspect of compose that was demonstrated by the last two photos, and that's the orientation of the camera. Let me show you. Camera orientation refers to the angle of the camera relative to the horizon. If you are shooting only for Instagram, then you can use a square format, such as this, and therefore the camera orientation doesn't make any difference. Typically, though, the image is rectangular. If it's vertical, it's called portrait mode, and if it's horizontal, landscape mode. In general, use portrait mode to reinforce strong vertical lines, and landscape mode to reinforce strong horizontal lines. However, the image does not have to be only horizontal or vertical. It can also be tipped, such as in this photo. But please, please keep the image level if you are shooting portrait or landscape mode. For me, there is nothing more distracting in a photo than having the image tipped, even just a little, when it is obvious that it needs to be level, as in this photo and in this photo. The good news is that if we do make a mistake, it is easy to fix in the transpose step that we'll talk about in a later lesson. We've presented 5 foundation topics in the compose step of taking photographs: using the rule of thirds, adjusting background, creating depth, framing the subject, and camera orientation. In the next lesson, expose, we'll learn how to use 2 key controls available in virtually every camera that enable us to further adjust the image and then capture that image in the camera.